Our guest tonight is going to talk to us about William Morris and Company in Adelaide. He's Curator of Decorative Arts at the Art Gallery of South Australia. Before that, he was with the Australian National Gallery. Would you please make welcome Christopher Menz?
Tonight's lecture I've titled From St James's Palace to Torrens Park. The reasons have become evident as we progress through it. It deals with the Morris and Company interiors in South Australia, and primarily deals with the interiors of one family, that of Robert and Joanna Barr Smith, at their major house, which was Torrens Park, but also at other houses in and around Adelaide and South Australia. Now, the problem with interior decoration is something that we all grapple with, I guess, in some way or another. Even people, the very few who have unlimited means, have trouble. And problems in the 19th century are every bit as difficult as they are in the 20th. Charles Locke Eastlake wrote a book called Hints on Household Taste, first published in 1868, which went into several editions. And it was very influential, very popular, some of the ideas cover our period quite well. And as he wrote, in the field of taste it is always much easier to point out paths which should be avoided than to indicate the road which leads to excellence. Really here steps in the role of a professional interior decorator. And this is really what William Morris at his firm Morris and Company ended up becoming. Morris was born in 1834 and died in 1896. Born to affluent parents, he initially thought he'd take to the cloth and then decided on a life of architecture, and this is while he was at Oxford University. He became very good friends with the painter Edward Burne-Jones, who also collaborated with him on a lot of his work. Morris is very much part of a mid and second half of 19th century British but also European fashion for the medieval, for Gothic revival. And at Oxford, where he became articled to the architect Edmund Street, who was an architect working in the Gothic revival, Morris certainly became imbued very much with the spirit of the age for the things medieval, for the things Gothic. He became an authority on Gothic and medieval art, travelled extensively through Europe at a time when the development really which leads to modern art historical research on that period was really opening up. Interestingly, working for Street, and this is in the 1850s, he probably had his first exposure to contemporary, sort of modern textiles that are in the Gothic revival. Street was doing a lot of churches, and the vestments, altar cloths, those sorts of things that go into churches in the Gothic revival were in a Gothic revival textile design. So certainly early on in his career, he started to become involved with that area. He married in the late 1850s and set about this well-off young couple building a house in Kent, which he got Philip Webb, friend of his and one of the leading architects of the age, to design, that was as he saw it, in a medieval type of manner. According to William Morris, he set up a firm that became Morris and Company in 1861 in London. To his own, he says that this partly developed out of not being able to find things to furnish his own house that were at all suitable. It was initially funded with an injection of capital from Morris's mother and other shareholders. It was a bit like a cooperative. He had people like Edward Burne-Jones, Ford Madox Brown, other leading artists of the age, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who incidentally also had a relationship with Morris's wife, so it was a slightly complex business and social setup going on. And the firm designed works that other people made up for them, and also eventually started designing and producing their own textiles and stained glass. But initially they made furniture, some wallpapers, and Powell & Sons made stained glass for them. In 1862 they exhibited at the International Exhibition in London and gained quite some acclaim. Their furniture was described as being in the medieval or Gothic style. By the late 1860s they were doing some of the interiors at St James's Palace, so by that stage they'd gained royal patronage and were well on the way to becoming a highly successful decorating firm. Bear in mind Morris is still only in his 30s, so he's doing quite well. The great interest that Morris had, and where he is a really great designer and a very innovative one, was one of the things he reacted very much against were commercially available fabrics and colours that were flooding mid-Victorian England. He liked historic fabrics, so he thought, why do I like them? What's nice about them? There's the colour, there's the texture of the fabrics, the way they're woven, the way they're embroidered, and there's also the way the patterns work. And then he figured out, well, why do these patterns please me? What's nice about them? He looked at the repeats, he looked at the way, and we'll be looking at them more closely, he looked at the juxtaposition of scale and the juxtaposition of curves and straight lines, and looking at historical textiles then developed unmistakably in his own style. A lot of them are based on 17th and earlier century patterns. And so in a sense totally revitalised textile design, but very much conscious of the historic past. His decorating business developed in London. It started to, as one can imagine, a fairly loose partnership in by the sort of late 1860s, early 1870s. The contribution of various members was a bit uneven, and Morris decided to take sole control. And in 1875, the firm, under Morris's sole direction, was renamed and restructured Morris and Company. He bought out, amongst some animosity, the other partners. It's also the same time that the joint tenancy that he and Rossetti had together, also with Morris's wife, on their house stopped. So there's a big change both emotionally and also in his business. Now, Morris and Company shop at Oxford Street in the late 19th century. What he managed to do was really create the one-stop interior decorating shop. You'd go from the floor to the ceiling, the carpets, the curtains, the wallpapers. They also had an interior decorating arm that would advise on paint colours, and they could be pretty dogmatic. They could end up doing it, if you gave them a free hand, the whole look was very much controlled by the business. The prospectus from the firm gives you an idea. I'll read a bit of it here. This is advertising, but it says that we manufacture almost everything in modern furnishing. Wallpapers, cretonnes, mohair damasks and tapestries for curtains and furniture coverings, stamped and printed velvets, silk, brocade, silk and linen fabrics, embroidery, carpets, tiles, metalworks, windows, and then they go on. Morris and Company undertake the entire decoration, furnishing and lighting of houses on strictly moderate terms, their prices throughout being based on direct dealings with their customers and including no extra profits or commissions to middlemen. Customers may thus feel assured that they are getting not only fine designs and colours, cheap chemical dyes being excluded from all the Merton Abbey work, but also the highest quality of workmanship at the lowest price at which it can be sold. So appealing to fairly, prevalent feelings that we like to get good value, well-made things that will last forever, that are nicely designed, and a sort of nostalgia that's looking at objects and encouraging people to buy things that are handmade, made in a traditional way. And what Morris did was actually develop things being made in a traditional way in order to achieve the beautiful dye colours that he liked. For instance, he looked up old dye recipe books, he became an expert on dyeing, and effectively rediscovered the use of natural dyes such as indigo, madder, and the like, those sorts of things. He taught himself to weave, he taught himself to print fabrics and then taught other people to do it, and also taught himself to embroider that he could then teach other people to do. And you get an idea from the screen. On this screen, on my side, is the Merton Abbey workshops. These were founded, Morris was looking for a place near London where he could dye fabrics in the right sort of water that gave the right conditions, and after much searching settled on Merton Abbey, which is sort of near Wimbledon, and even in the 1880s the streams were unpolluted. It's on a tributary of the Thames. Incidentally, had also been it was an abbey, but then it became an Huguenot dye factory in the late 17th, early 18th century, and had fallen into disrepair. Here he set up workshops in which fabrics could be dyed, carpets woven, tapestries woven. The potter, William de Morgan, had his pottery nearby. Stained glass windows were also made here. That was bought, or the lease was taken in 1881, and then it was operating from 1882. Morris, although the firm made a great deal of the fabrics, he contracted all the wallpapers out to a printing firm called Jeffrey and Company, and certainly for big commissions for fabrics, quite a lot were printed by outside printers. A lot of it was done by a man called Thomas Wardle, later Sir Thomas Wardle, who was a dye maker and a fabric printer at Leek. Morris is often stated as liking his very sumptuous fabrics and designs against plain interiors, and you can see these are two Morris interiors done by the firm in Britain. On the left-hand side is number 1 Holland Park, the drawing room. Every furnishing in the room supplied by the firm, curtains, wallpapers, carpets, the lot. And on the right-hand side, an interior by called at Stanmore Hall for William Knox Darcy, Australian mining engineer who made a great deal of money and then proceeded to spend it in great style when he got back to Britain. This gives you an idea of interiors that are being done in Britain by Morris and Company in the 1880s for their upper middle class clients. Very sumptuous. In the black and white, one does get a sense that it might look a bit cluttered. With the combination of textures of different patterns, all strong, under the right guidance and put together very carefully, they would actually relate quite well, but obviously we can't get that from the colours from the black and white. Now, where this relates to Adelaide is that the South Australian, or became South Australian couple, Robert and Joanna Barr Smith. Robert Barr Smith made a great deal of money as a partly pastoralist, mining ventures and trading, also with his brother-in-law, later Sir Thomas Elder, and founded the firm that became Elder Smiths in South Australia. He and his wife settled in Adelaide in 1857. During the 60s and early 70s, they really started to consolidate their wealth, and by the late 1870s, things seemed to be going extremely well for them. Having lived in a lot of houses, finally settled on one to buy, which they bought in 1874, which is Torrens Park, which is now Scotch College. They made alterations then, and then in 1879 decided to do really big extensions. We don't quite know why the Barr Smiths settled on Morris and Company. There's a family story that one of the daughters was at school with May Morris. This hasn't been substantiated at the school that May Morris went to. Nevertheless, if the Barr Smiths, who are in London a lot and planning these grand building schemes in the early 1880s, could hardly have been unaware of Morris and Company. They were also using a London architect to advise them, who would have known of this firm. Morris at that stage, with both taking sole control of the firm in 1875 and then setting up his new workshops, doing everything in his power to create new business. Certainly by 1884, late in December 1884, which is when we have the first invoices, Robert Barr Smith was at Morris and Company's shop ordering wallpaper, and the first wallpaper that comes to South Australia is one that's called St James's. Morris and Company were redoing bits of St James's Palace from 1880 and 1881, for which they designed several fabrics, a wallpaper they called St James's, and a silk furnishing fabric of the same name, and one called Oak. And here we see a bit of St James's on the right-hand side, the wallpaper. Very big pattern, blue and gold spots all on the background. And on the left-hand side is the Barr Smith's grand drawing room at Torrens Park. Eastlake, again, I'll read to you about his ideas on wallpaper. The most important question will be whether it is to form decoration itself or whether it is to become a mere background for pictures. Notice in the drawing room, pictures are completely banished from this room, and as you can imagine, not much would compete with the paper. Eastlake also recommended that wallpapers go from floor to ceiling. There should be no dado as you get in this room. You just go from skirting board to the ceiling, and don't break the wall. Also, Eastlake, and he could have been writing of this pattern, gold, when judiciously introduced, may be a valuable adjunct in the design of paper hanging. It frequently, however, doubles and sometimes trebles the price of a piece, and Messrs Morris, Marshall and Co. have produced some admirable examples of this class. This particular paper takes about, the way they print wallpapers is, traditionally was with wooden blocks, and they print them in different colours and they fit them together to make a mosaic. Obviously the more blocks and the more different colours you use, the more labour intensive, the more expensive. This one took about 80 blocks which it was like double their most expensive in terms of blocks, and probably double the price of the twice as expensive as their next most expensive paper. The pattern's very big. It also takes two widths to actually make the pattern, so it gives you an idea of the scale of it. Now, this big drawing room is 48 feet by 24 feet, so it gives you some sense of the scale, and all the furnishings in it are supplied by the firm. There's the wallpaper, the carpets, which we'll see similar ones in a moment, and the silk chair coverings closest to you, as well as the curtains. Apparently, from records, Morris and Company certainly were involved in selecting some of the paint schemes for some of the rooms in Torrens Park. It may have extended to a considerable number of the Barr Smith's houses, but we only know that some of the rooms at Torrens Park were involved with Morris. The fabric on the right-hand side is the St James's silk, a damask woven fabric, so the pattern is developed by having contrast between the sheen and the flat of the fabric. Perhaps these types of fabrics are, to our taste, Morris's least characteristic designs, and perhaps in some ways the least interesting. But bear in mind the fashion for what they were designed for, which is a royal stateroom, would normally have had, even in the 19th century, reproductions of 18th century damask woven silk. So the best thing is to go within the taste but cash in on it and do it a bit better than everybody else. And that extraordinary colour seems to be the curtain fabric that went in this room. They're currently in Ayres House, that particular piece. Some of the other fabric designs used in the room, an embroidery mantle border. You get an indication of one of the repeating themes that appears in a lot of Morris's designs is repeating scrolls. One of the things about Morris is he designed a lot of the fabrics for the firm, but it really developed a house style, and another designer who worked for the firm, who trained within the business, called John Henry Durrell, spelled D-E-A-R-L-E, became a principal designer from the late 1880s onwards into the 1930s, and also Morris's daughter May designed a lot of the embroideries and won wallpaper, and various other people were contracted out to supply designs for the business. But Morris being the famous one, they tended to, in the 19th century anyway, blur a bit of the distinction about who did the designing. The next room is the second drawing room at Torrens Park has this peacock and dragon curtain, a dove and rose curtain, which is a woven silk and wool, designed about 1878 by Morris. And there are really only about three major different types of design that Morris fixes on and then plays around with them in variations. And the sort of degree of spending was obviously a bit of a bone of contention between Robert Barr Smith and his wife. He seems to be very much involved in these building projects and interior decoration, so we really don't know how much is him and how much is her. There's a nice letter that he wrote to her and says that she's staying in Berlin in a hotel and everything's gone wrong on the trip. But she says, I felt genuinely sorry to take such an expensive suite of rooms and could only do it and reconcile it to my conscience at all by saying, well, my husband is rich and he should wish me to have every comfort. Neither I nor your children ever for one moment have or could think you are stingy. We only sometimes think that your early Scotch training makes you a little careful in small things, and then to women small things are so important. It's also interesting that these interiors, certainly at Torrens Park and the next house, Auchendorroch, were photographed a lot. They obviously consider them to be quite important. They're professional photographs. They were circulated amongst friends and family. Enough have come to light that obviously they passed them around their friends. And he certainly wanted to do this. And it compares with another visit. Her husband visited Lady Clark at a big house in Mandeville Hall in Melbourne. And he's written to her and she writes back, what a funny thing of Lady Clark to show you her grandeur by the light of a taper. Why did not she light up her ballroom and let you have the benefit of everything? And one certainly feels that the Barr Smiths in these sumptuously grand interiors would have made sure one had the benefit of everything the whole time. This is the dining room in the same house. Interestingly, the carpet on the left-hand side is the carpet from the room. It is one of these hand-knotted Morris and Company carpets. That sort of size, or a bit smaller, would have been around about £130. So that gives you an idea of the sort of price range then for hand-knotted carpets. The wallpaper is a dark green colour. I don't actually know what the curtains are in there. The dining room had been totally done over in the 1870s and then has to have been done over at some time in the 1880s once I think Morris interior sort of took hold in the drawing room and then gradually spread through most of the house. It's surprisingly, in view of all these expensive interiors, apart from invoices and the odd painting direction in letters from Robert Barr Smith to his agents, there's actually very little about them in what survives as an extremely large correspondence. However, we do have one reference to this particular room. Robert and Joanna and the family decamped to a big house at Mount Barker for the hot weather and then came down to Torrens Park from May through to about November. So among them also came the family pet, the dog called Shuts. After having the house done over, ready for habitation in May, Joanna wrote to her husband, "Shuts is quite happy here again and knows the way about. He sleeps in his basket in the old way, and I've taught him to eat his meals behind the pantry door, for I knew it would just break your heart or else cause a rupture between us if ever I were to be caught feeding him on the dining room Morris carpet. You see how considerate I am of your feelings." On a probably more serious note about interior decoration, notice that this has a parquetry border around the room, and certainly the fashion for carpet going skirting board to skirting board was around in the 19th century, but decorators like Eastlake and certainly Morris liked the fact that there was timber showing under the carpet or around the carpet. Now, one of the reasons of this, in this idea of truth to materials, is that if you actually show the timber, the surface is hard, and then you have a carpet on it, you can actually see what it's meant to do. If you actually see the timber, a bit of it, and then carpet, you can see how the carpet fits in relation to a hard surface. Also, in this particular house, despite the money spent on it, borders, and it was quite common practice, parquetry borders that just did the bit that you saw were ordered, and then the carpets, and there'd be deal underneath it, or perhaps just boards like this underneath the area that was covered by carpet. So the carpets are actually ordered to size or fitted specially for the rooms. Also with the Morris's carpets, I don't know how many different designs were made, but it'd be the order of 100, ranging from what we'd call hearth rugs to carpets that are about 30 feet long. The more prominent ones were reproduced, say, up to half a dozen times, but at least about 6 of the carpets that the Barr Smiths had were only ever made for those particular rooms once, so they're, in that sense, are unique designs. While Torrens Park is being done up in the late 1870s, early 1880s, Auchindorup, which is the big house at Mount Barker, for those of you who know it, was also being extensively done over. They don't seem to have actually built houses from scratch, but sort of taken something else that was big and then added to it extensively. So architecturally they can be a bit, nowadays especially without their original fittings, they can look a bit odd. And Auchindorup is in some ways. This is the Hill Station Retreat, the drawing room not much less sumptuous than the one in town. The green silk curtains were also designed for St James's Palace, and they're called Oak. Morris wallpaper, Morris carpet, embroidery on the table covers Morris, and so are all the other furnishings. That's the carpet they're sitting on, and on the right hand side is a table cover made up of the green silk curtains. It gives you an indication of the sort of colour blend that went on in that room. A lot of pinks and greens, but also yellow. One can get an indication from 19th century slides of interiors that they may have lacked cohesion, but I think in this room you can get some of the sense of the Morris and Company style. And you can see what they're trying to achieve with this sort of symphony of texture and pattern working together.